Imagine an empire so incredibly vast that the sun never set on its borders, an army that had never tasted defeat, a treasury so overflowing with gold that they used it to pave the streets of the capital. Yet, in less than a single decade, this entire, monumental civilization was completely erased from history. They were not wiped out by a terrifying plague. They were not crushed by a catastrophic natural disaster. And they were not conquered in a bloody war. They were utterly annihilated by a rock. A single, mesmerizing, impossibly cursed piece of crystallized carbon that drove the most powerful rulers on Earth to absolute foaming madness. Imagine a king willingly starving his own children to death just to afford one more facet cut into this stone. What you are about to hear is not a myth, nor a legend meant to scare children. It is the heavily suppressed history of the greatest financial and psychological suicide humanity has ever witnessed. And the most terrifying part of this entire story? The exact same psychological trap that destroyed them is still operating right now, perhaps even in your own life. Let us rewind to the absolute peak of this nameless, forgotten empire. For centuries, it stood as the undisputed jewel of the ancient world. Their cities were carved from flawless white marble, their bustling markets flooded with exotic silk, rare spices, and precious metals. Their borders were considered impenetrable, guarded by men who had never known fear. The emperor sat on a magnificent throne that rivaled the descriptions of the gods themselves. But there is a dark, hidden truth about absolute power. It creates an absolute, gnawing void in the human soul. When you already possess everything the material world has to offer, what do you crave? You crave the impossible. You crave the forbidden. The terrifying descent into hell began on a completely ordinary day. A mysterious merchant from an unmapped land far beyond the treacherous eastern mountains arrived at the massive palace gates. He was a horrific sight. He was violently starved, wildly delirious, and missing half of his fingers, yet he refused to let go of a small, heavily reinforced iron lockbox. He did not ask for gold. He did not beg for food or water. He only demanded, with a manic intensity, to show the mighty emperor exactly what was hidden inside the box. The merchant's eyes were heavily clouded with thick cataracts, yet he stared at that iron box as if it held the blazing sun. The emperor's elite guards tried to forcefully pry it from his bleeding hands, but his grip was locked like a corpse's rigor mortis. Finally, the emperor, mildly amused by this pathetic and bizarre display, ordered the box to be opened right there in the grand throne room. What lay inside fundamentally defied the known laws of nature. It was a gemstone, but it was absolutely nothing like any sapphire, ruby, or diamond the world had ever seen. It was roughly the size of a human heart, and it was aggressively pulsating with an inner, violent, almost radioactive violet light. It did not reflect the hundreds of torches illuminating the throne room. Instead, it seemed to actively consume them. The shadows in the grand room literally appeared to stretch toward the stone, as if bending to its gravity. The emperor was instantly completely mesmerized. He immediately offered the sickly merchant a literal mountain of gold in exchange. The merchant just smiled a dry, horrific, toothless smile and whispered a chilling warning that history has desperately tried to bury. He said, "It does not cost gold. It costs absolutely everything." The emperor eagerly took the stone without a second thought. The merchant was found dead in the gutter the very next morning, his face frozen in a mask of pure terror. But absolutely nobody in the royal court cared. They were already entirely consumed by the jewel. At first, it was treated simply as a beautiful, exotic artifact. The emperor had it carefully placed on a massive obsidian pedestal in the absolute dead center of his grand hall. But soon, highly disturbing things began to happen around the palace. The stone seemed to inexplicably change its hue and brightness depending on exactly who was looking at it. A dark, suffocating paranoia quickly set in among the nobility. The emperor became deeply convinced that the stone was somehow lonely, and that it required companions to maintain its blinding brilliance. He urgently ordered his royal treasurers to immediately purchase the finest, most flawless diamonds, emeralds and rubies from across the entire known world just to physically surround the main jewel. This wasn't merely a royal collection anymore. It rapidly mutated into a ravenous, world-ending obsession. The state's massive budget for agriculture was instantly slashed. Then the critical budget for public infrastructure was completely cut. The grand, life-saving aqueducts began to physically crumble and fail. The emperor did not care. He strictly needed more gems. Now pause for a second. Think about the sheer mind-bending absurdity of this situation. You are a loyal citizen of the most powerful empire on earth. You are literally starving in the dirt outside the palace gates, your children crying from hunger, and you look up to see the emperor's hunting dogs wearing diamond-encrusted collars worth vastly more than your entire burning city. Why didn't the people just revolt? Why didn't the powerful military generals stage a violent coup and simply take the stone? Here is where the story stops making logical sense and dives into pure psychological horror. Madness is highly contagious. The High Court did not stop the emperor because they became severely infected with the exact same blinding greed. If the emperor was walking around wearing a heavy cape woven entirely with crushed pearls, the generals suddenly felt they strictly needed battle swords with solid sapphire hilts just to remain relevant. The wealthy ministers aggressively demanded wooden carriages wholly encrusted with polished jade. A silent, deadly, and entirely psychotic competition was born inside the palace walls. The kingdom's unimaginable wealth was being rapidly and recklessly liquidated. Mountains of vital, life-sustaining resources like grain, raw iron, and sturdy timber were desperately sold off to hostile foreign rivals at ridiculously low prices, all strictly to fund the immediate, frantic purchase of more precious stones. The mighty economy began a terrifying, unstoppable freefall. Hyperinflation skyrocketed overnight. A single, moldy loaf of bread suddenly cost an entire month's wages. But inside the heavily guarded palace walls, it was an eternal, glittering, blinding party. The emperor deployed an incredibly dark and manipulative psychological trick to keep the starving masses at bay. He publicly convinced the terrified citizens that the violet jewel was a literal divine mandate sent from the heavens. He loudly proclaimed that the stone was actively protecting them from dark demonic spirits, holding back the apocalyptic wrath of the gods. He then instituted a mandatory protection tax. Yes, he actually taxed the starving, dying peasants so he could buy even more gems to artificially power the main stone. And the people, completely paralyzed by religious fear and deep superstition, actually paid it. Historical fragments suggest families willingly sold their own children into brutal slavery just to pay the jewel tax, believing they were saving the world. The entire kingdom was violently cannibalizing itself. The legendary military, completely unpaid and unfed for years, quietly began to desert into the night. The massive border fortresses, once the pride of the empire, were left entirely abandoned to the wind. The magnificent, invincible empire was now nothing more than a hollow, decaying shell full of glittering stones, sitting completely defenseless in the dark. Inside the royal palace, the atmosphere rapidly mutated from breathtaking opulence to a macabre, suffocating nightmare. The emperor completely stopped sleeping. He spent his days and nights locked in the dark underground vault, simply staring unblinkingly at the pulsating purple stone. Horrific reports from the royal physician, which were centuries later found hidden inside a hollow stone wall, graphically described the emperor's terrifying physical decay. His skin turned almost completely translucent, revealing the dark veins underneath. He violently refused to eat any solid food, madly claiming that the mesmerizing light of the stone was his only required physical sustenance. The highest court officials blindly followed suit. The Grand Palace literally became a haunted house of walking, emaciated skeletons violently draped in unimaginable wealth. They moved incredibly slowly, physically weighed down by dozens of pounds of solid gold and heavy jewels, their eyes deeply hollow, constantly whispering to the lifeless stones. Then the inevitable happened. The state treasury officially hit zero. There was not a single solitary copper coin left in the entire empire. The massive public granaries were completely empty, echoing with the wind. The beautiful rivers were heavily choked with the rotting bodies of the starved. And the bitter enemies of the empire, who had watched this bizarre, slow-motion suicide with absolute stunned disbelief for years, finally made their aggressive move. A massive, brutal coalition of ruthless barbarian tribes, who previously wouldn't have even dared to approach within 100 miles of the heavily fortified borders, simply walked right in. There was absolutely zero military resistance. The massive iron gates of the supposedly impregnable cities were literally rusting and hanging off their broken hinges. The once grand markets were terrifying ghost towns filled with dust and bones. The invaders marched directly toward the shimmering capital city without shedding a single drop of blood. They fully expected a massive, bloody final battle. They expected deadly hidden traps. They expected to face the Emperor's legendary, fiercely loyal royal guard. What they actually found instead permanently chilled them to the absolute bone. The massive, towering bronze doors of the royal palace were sitting, wide open, creaking loudly in the wind. The heavily armed invaders nervously crept inside, their bloody swords drawn, heavily sweating with intense, terrifying tension. The silence inside the palace was absolutely deafening. There were no armed guards. There were no terrified servants running for their lives. As they slowly entered the grand throne room, a horrific, overpowering stench of death violently hit them, making strong men gag. The massive room was blindingly bright, reflecting the morning sun off literally millions of loose, precious stones that were carelessly scattered across the marble floor like entirely useless gravel. And there, sitting rigidly on the grand throne, was the Emperor. He was completely dead. In fact, judging by the horrific state of decay, he had been dead for many weeks. The entire glittering royal court lay violently scattered around the enormous room, completely dead from severe starvation. They had purposely locked themselves securely inside, completely surrounded by vastly more monetary wealth than existed in the rest of the known world combined, and they had simply quietly starved to death while staring blankly at their sparkling treasures. But the nervous invaders weren't looking at the decaying bodies on the floor. They were entirely focused on the dead Emperor's rotting chest, the great pulsating purple jewel, the absolute heart of the infectious madness, had been violently and purposefully jammed deeply into the Emperor's own shattered ribcage. His skeletal, decaying hands were still frantically clutching it, in a death grip. The ruthless barbarian king, a hardened man who had personally slaughtered thousands of men without a second thought, felt a deep, cold, primal terror violently grip his soul. He approached the throne incredibly slowly, his breath catching in his throat. He reached out his scarred hand to take the ultimate legendary prize. His dirty fingers gently brushed the smooth surface of the glowing purple stone, and instantly, without a single sound, it completely shattered. It didn't break into smaller, valuable pieces. It instantly dissolved into a fine, gray, incredibly foul-smelling ash that simply slipped uselessly right through his trembling fingers. It was never actually a jewel, or at least not a normal earthly one. Centuries later, brilliant ancient alchemists who studied the surviving texts theorized it was actually a highly toxic, severely radioactive compound artificially carved to perfectly mimic a gemstone. It was a terrifying weapon, designed specifically to severely poison the human mind, instantly inducing severe, irreversible paranoia, vivid hallucinations, and extreme obsessive-compulsive hoarding. It was a flawless biological weapon brilliantly disguised as a priceless royal gift. It was sent by a much weaker, highly intelligent enemy, who fully knew they could never possibly win a physical war of swords, so they mercilessly waged a silent war of psychology. They didn't have to defeat the greatest empire on Earth. They simply handed them the exact psychological tool needed to completely destroy themselves. And it worked. Absolutely perfectly. The great empire was permanently erased from all maps. The unimaginable wealth was eventually looted and scattered to the winds. But the underlying psychological virus, the blinding, irrational, utterly destructive obsession with shiny, entirely useless things, survived the collapse. It immediately infected the brutal invaders. It slowly infected the next massive kingdoms to rise. And if you dare to look closely at our modern world today, at the utterly meaningless things ordinary people willingly sacrifice their entire lives, their families, and their very sanity to acquire, you truly have to stop and wonder, did that cursed purple ash ever really blow away? Or are every single one of us still deeply breathing it in right now?